On the morning of October 11th, 2025, the world woke up to the news that Diane Keaton was gone. For Hollywood, it was the loss of an icon. For Al Pacino, it was the collapse of a lifetime he never fully lived. The message arrived quietly, without ceremony, glowing on a phone screen in a room that suddenly felt too large to breathe in. Pacino did not cry out. He did not call anyone. He locked the doors of his Beverly Hills home and sat alone, holding a phone that seemed heavier than any script he had ever memorized. According to those close to him, Pacino almost collapsed when he read the words. Not because death surprised him, but because finality did. Diane Keaton had always existed in his life as a constant, even when they were apart. A voice he could still call. A presence he assumed would always remain somewhere in the world, laughing, thinking, living. And now, in a single line of text, that assumption vanished. He pulled out old photographs. Diane smiling, unguarded. Diane's handwritten notes, the ink slightly faded, her wit still alive on the page. His hands trembled as if he were touching warmth that had not yet accepted it was gone. In a rare moment of emotional collapse, Pacino reportedly admitted something he had never allowed himself to say out loud. The biggest regret of his life was not marrying Diane. For a man who spent more than half a century mastering silence, restraint, and control, that confession cut deeper than any role he ever played. Al Pacino's life had always been a long battle between light and shadow. From a poor Bronx childhood to becoming one of the most revered actors in cinematic history, he experienced every extreme Hollywood could offer. Fame, addiction, financial ruin, resurrection. And through many of those darkest chapters, Diane Keaton remained quietly beside him, not demanding, not saving him loudly, but steady enough to keep him from falling apart completely. Now she was gone, and with her disappeared the last witness to the version of himself he had never allowed the world to see. At 85, Pacino's grief was not theatrical. It was not dramatic. It was heavy, slow, and suffocating. He wandered the house they once shared, brushing his fingers across shelves and frames, realizing the silence was no longer shared. It was absolute. The roles he once played, the criminals, the lovers, the broken men, all felt distant. None of them prepared him for the role he was now forced to inhabit. Himself, an old man, finally facing the cost of hesitation. When Pacino first met Diane Keaton on the set of The Godfather, he believed love did not require permanence. Understanding was enough. Freedom was enough. Time proved otherwise. And now, with Diane gone, time offered no second takes. No rewrites. No applause. Only the echo of a life lived just one step too far from courage. After the first shock faded, what remained for Al Pacino was not chaos, but a brutal clarity. Grief did not arrive as screaming pain. It arrived as order. Every memory suddenly lined itself up, demanding to be acknowledged. In the quiet days after Diane Keaton's death, Pacino did not leave his house. He did not answer calls. He lived among objects that now felt accusatory. Photographs, books, letters. Each one asked the same question he had spent decades avoiding. Why did you never stay? Their relationship had never been simple, but it had always been real. From the moment they met during the early days of The Godfather, there was a quiet gravity between them. Diane was drawn to Pacino's intensity, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way his silence felt intentional rather than empty. Pacino, in turn, was disarmed by Diane's freedom. She laughed easily. She questioned authority instinctively. She moved through the world without armor. Where Pacino guarded himself, Diane opened doors. For years, Pacino believed that love did not need definition, that labels restricted what was meant to be fluid. They were artists, companions, lovers, collaborators. They shared homes. They shared routines. They shared long nights discussing scripts and fears that never made it into interviews. But beneath that shared life lived an imbalance. Diane waited. Pacino hesitated. He told himself he was protecting freedom, protecting creativity, protecting the fragile equilibrium that allowed him to function. Marriage, to him, felt like a verdict rather than a promise. A door closing instead of opening. And so he chose silence. Again and again. Not loudly, not cruelly, but decisively enough that time began to harden around it. What haunted Pacino later was not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of small choices. The dinners postponed, the calls unanswered, the nights when he chose the set over conversation, ambition over intimacy. Diane did not leave suddenly. She stayed longer than most would have. She believed, for years, that eventually he would choose her fully. She even joked about it, masking hope with humor. But patience has a limit, even when love is deep. In the transcript's emotional core, Pacino's regret is framed not as guilt, but as realization. He did not lose Diane because he stopped loving her. He lost her because he never learned how to hold love without fear. When she finally asked him to choose, to build something permanent, he did what he had always done. He stayed silent, and silence, once again, made the decision for him. After their separation, Pacino rarely spoke of Diane publicly. When her name appeared in interviews, he smiled. He praised her intelligence, her honesty, her integrity as an artist. But he avoided the language of loss, avoided the word regret. It was easier to frame the story as two independent people choosing different paths than to admit one path was chosen through an action. Now, after her death, that narrative collapsed. Alone in his house, Pacino confronted the truth he had buried beneath decades of work and acclaim. Diane had been the one person who made him feel safe without asking him to disappear. The one person who understood his darkness without trying to fix it. He had searched for that feeling in other relationships, but nothing else lasted. Everything else felt temporary, thin, replaceable. At 85, Pacino finally understood what he had mistaken for strength was often fear. Fear of being needed. Fear of being known too deeply. Fear of committing to something he could not control. Diane had offered him something rare. A love that asked him to remain, not perform. And when he failed to answer, time answered for him. In the silence that followed her passing, Pacino realized that some roles cannot be postponed. Some decisions cannot be deferred without consequence. Love, once refused too many times, does not wait forever. And regret, unlike ambition or fame, does not fade with age. It sharpens. It stays. To understand why the loss of Diane Keaton shattered Al Pacino so completely, one must understand that their relationship was never meant to be ordinary. It was not a romance built on stability, nor a partnership designed for permanence. It was a love born in tension, sustained by art, and slowly eroded by fear. And that is precisely why it endured for so long without ever reaching its end. They met in the early 1970s, during the turbulent production of The Godfather. Pacino was still an uncertain presence, a quiet actor under constant threat of being replaced. Keaton was sharp, unconventional, and already comfortable questioning authority. From the beginning, they recognized something familiar in each other. Both were outsiders in their own way. Both resisted the glossy expectations of Hollywood, and both were drawn to emotional truth more than image. What followed was not a linear romance, but a long, circular orbit. They moved toward each other, drifted apart, and returned again, as if gravity refused to let them escape completely. Their bond survived distance, career fluctuations, and long periods of separation, because it was not built on possession. It was built on recognition. They saw each other clearly, and for Pacino, that clarity was both comforting and terrifying. Diane Keaton represented a kind of freedom Pacino admired, but could not replicate. She embraced independence without withdrawal. She could love without disappearing into the other person. Pacino, by contrast, lived in extremes. When he worked, he vanished into obsession. When he loved intensely, but always with one foot already stepping back. His childhood had taught him that attachment was temporary and loss was inevitable. Commitment felt like inviting pain inside and asking it to stay. Throughout their years together, Keaton adapted. She gave space. She accepted ambiguity. She learned the rhythms of a man who needed silence the way others needed reassurance. But love, even when patient, has a breaking point. Over time, Keaton began to realize that what Pacino called freedom often meant emotional distance. What he framed as independence often left her waiting. The most devastating truth of their relationship is that it did not fail because of betrayal, cruelty, or a lack of affection. It failed because Pacino never chose it fully. When Keaton finally asked for clarity, for marriage, for something permanent after nearly 2 decades of emotional investment, Pacino could not answer. Not because he did not care, but because answering meant confronting the one thing he feared most. Staying. Silence became his response, as it had so often before. And silence, in the end, was louder than rejection. Keaton understood what that silence meant. It meant that love, for Pacino, could exist only as long as it remained undefined. Once it required structure, it became unbearable. And so she did the one thing he never expected. She walked away quietly. After their separation, both lives unfolded outwardly successful, but inwardly incomplete. Keaton never married. She built a life centered on her work, her children, and her autonomy. Pacino continued his ascent into legend, collecting accolades, iconic roles, and cultural reverence. But something fundamental had shifted. Those closest to him noticed that after Diane, his relationships became shorter, less rooted, more transient. He was surrounded by people, yet increasingly alone. Years later, in interviews and in his memoir, Pacino spoke of Diane not as an ex-lover, but as a presence. Someone who made the silence less heavy. Someone who understood him without explanation. Those words carry more weight than any public declaration of love. They reveal what he lost. Not companionship, not romance, but recognition. When Diane Keaton died, that recognition vanished from the world. Pacino did not just lose a former partner. He lost the only person who had known him before the myth solidified, before the legend hardened into armor, before fear disguised itself as artistic integrity. Her death erased the last living connection to a version of himself that still believed love could be lived rather than postponed. Now, in the twilight of his life, Pacino is left confronting a truth he once avoided. Love does not remain available forever. It does not wait patiently for courage to arrive. It asks once, sometimes twice, and when the answer never comes, it leaves. Not angrily, not dramatically, just permanently. The tragedy of Al Pacino is not that he loved Diane Keaton and lost her. It is that he loved her deeply, consistently, and sincerely, yet never found the courage to choose her when it mattered most. And in that failure lies a universal ache. Because genius may excuse many flaws, but it does not exempt anyone from regret. Their story has no final act, no reconciliation, no closure scene. Only the quiet understanding that some love stories are not meant to end with togetherness, but with realization. And realization, when it arrives too late, becomes the heaviest role of all. After Diane Keaton walked away, the world assumed the story had ended. To the public, it looked clean, almost elegant. 2 acclaimed artists choosing independence over compromise, each continuing a successful career without visible damage. But for Al Pacino, the departure did not close a chapter. It hollowed one out. What followed was not collapse, but a slow rearrangement of his inner life, one that few people were allowed to see. In the years after Diane left, Pacino worked constantly. Roles came one after another, many of them intense, volatile, and emotionally punishing. He threw himself into characters with an urgency that bordered on self-erasure. Criminals driven by hunger. Men isolated by power, souls corroded by obsession. Audiences praised the depth, the danger, the raw honesty of his performances. Few realized how closely those characters mirrored his private state. Acting became a way to feel without having to explain. The irony was cruel. As his career reached new heights, his personal life grew increasingly fragmented. Relationships entered and exited quietly, never staying long enough to demand permanence. Pacino was present, attentive, even affectionate, but always at a remove. Those close to him noticed a pattern. He could be deeply connected in moments, yet reluctant to build anything that extended beyond the present. It was as if love, once asked to become permanent, triggered an instinct to retreat. Meanwhile, Diane Keaton chose a radically different response to the end of their relationship. She did not chase replacement. She did not seek to rewrite the past. Instead, she turned inward, cultivating a life defined by autonomy and intention. She continued working, but at her own pace. She embraced her individuality more openly, leaning into her eccentricities rather than smoothing them for acceptance. Where Pacino buried himself in roles, Diane began building a home. Her decision to adopt children later in life was not an act of reaction, but resolution. She created family without waiting for permission from circumstance or tradition. Friends often noted that motherhood grounded her in a way romantic relationships never had. She found continuity where Pacino found motion, stability where he found escape. Their paths, once intertwined, now diverged completely, yet remained spiritually connected by everything they never finished saying. Pacino watched this from a distance. He respected her choices. He admired her clarity. But admiration did not ease the quiet sense of displacement that followed him. Diane had chosen something tangible, a life structured by commitment, even if unconventional. Pacino, by contrast, continued to orbit possibility without anchoring to it. His fame grew. His influence expanded. But the center of his life remained unsettled. This imbalance shaped the next decades. Pacino became a man constantly surrounded by people, yet profoundly solitary. Interviews often revealed a charming, thoughtful presence, but rarely intimacy. When asked about love, he spoke in abstractions. When asked about regret, he redirected toward art. The truth lingered beneath the surface, unspoken but persistent. Diane was not just a memory. She was a measure. Every relationship that followed was compared silently against what had once felt complete. Their occasional reunions, professional or social, carried an unmistakable undertone. Familiarity mixed with restraint. Warmth without invitation. They laughed easily, but never lingered too long. It was as if both understood that reopening the door would only reveal how much time had been lost. And so they kept it closed, not out of bitterness, but self-preservation. As years passed, Pacino's roles began to shift. He portrayed older men grappling with legacy, loss, and moral reckoning. The performances grew quieter, heavier, more reflective. Audiences sensed the change, even if they could not name it. He was no longer just playing tragedy. He was carrying it. Each role felt like an examination of roads not taken, of choices deferred until they calcified into fate. Diane, meanwhile, remained a presence of lightness in public life. Her interviews were thoughtful but playful. She spoke candidly about independence, aging, and contentment without bitterness. She did not frame her life as something that had gone wrong, but as something intentionally shaped. That contrast deepened Pacino's private reckoning. Diane had accepted the consequences of love. Pacino had postponed them. When news of her death finally arrived, it stripped away every illusion Pacino had built around the past. There was no longer a living bridge to that chapter of his life. No possibility of shared memory being acknowledged by the one person who truly understood it. Diane's passing turned what had once been a lingering possibility into a permanent absence. In that moment, Pacino understood that their story had not ended when she left. It had ended when he failed to choose. Everything after had been an epilogue he pretended was a new beginning. Her death forced him to confront the truth he had avoided for decades. Some losses do not announce themselves loudly. They unfold quietly, until one day there is nothing left to retrieve. The tragedy is not that two people separated. It is that they lived parallel lives afterward, each shaped by the same love in opposite ways. Diane built something from it. Pacino ran from it. And time, impartial and unforgiving, recorded both choices without judgment. Only consequence. By the time Pacino reached the later years of his life, the cost of that avoidance had become impossible to ignore. Fame could not distract him. Work could not protect him. And memory, once suppressed, returned with precision. Diane Keaton was no longer a chapter he could revisit. She had become the silence behind every achievement. The life he lived without her was successful, but it was never whole. By the time Al Pacino entered the later chapters of his life, time no longer felt like a neutral companion. It became a presence, measured not in years, but in absences, in rooms that stayed quiet longer than expected, in mornings that arrived without anticipation. The world still called him a legend, but legends age too, and age strips away distraction. What remains is memory, and memory does not negotiate. Pacino had spent decades outrunning stillness. Work was his shelter. Scripts were his oxygen. Each new role offered a temporary postponement of reckoning, a way to inhabit someone else's pain, so he would not have to sit with his own. But as the roles grew fewer and the nights grew longer, that strategy weakened. Silence returned. And with it came the question he had avoided since Diane Keaton walked away. What had all that movement been protecting him from? Old age has a way of clarifying priorities without mercy. Pacino's body slowed. His energy changed. Health scares reminded him that control was an illusion, not a skill. And with each reminder, the past crept closer, not as nostalgia, but as accounting. Diane was no longer just a former lover. She became the axis around which so many of his decisions now revolved in hindsight. Every refusal, every delay, every moment, he chose uncertainty over commitment. He had built a life rich in experience, but sparse in anchors. Children arrived later, in fragments of time that never fully overlapped. He loved them fiercely, yet even that love carried traces of his lifelong pattern. Present but cautious, devoted but divided. Fatherhood offered meaning, but did not erase the unresolved past. If anything, it sharpened it. Watching his children grow forced him to confront what he himself had never learned to do: stay. Meanwhile, Diane Keaton aged with a different kind of grace. She did not chase youth or relevance. She embraced eccentricity, solitude, and motherhood on her own terms. Observers often noted how grounded she seemed, how at ease with her choices. To Pacino, that ease was both comforting and painful. It confirmed what he had always known but refused to accept. Diane had not needed him to complete her life. She had needed him to choose her within it. As years passed, Pacino spoke more openly about fear, regret, and vulnerability, not in dramatic confessions, but in quiet admissions woven into interviews and reflections. He described himself as a man shaped by early loss, by instability, by a childhood that taught him to expect abandonment. Commitment, to him, had always felt like tempting fate. Better to leave first than be left. Better to remain undefined than risk collapse. But age dismantles defenses. It exposes the cost of survival strategies that once made sense. Pacino began to recognize that what he had called independence was often avoidance, that what he had framed as freedom was sometimes fear in disguise. Diane had offered him something radical, a love that did not demand performance, a presence that did not need conquest, and he had responded with hesitation. When Diane Keaton died, that realization crystallized into something unbearable. There would be no conversation to soften it, no shared laughter to dilute regret, no future reunion to reinterpret the past. Her death locked their story in place, uneditable and complete. For the first time, Pacino could no longer imagine a version of the future where he might finally explain himself. That door had closed without sound. Grief in old age is different. It is not explosive. It is cumulative. It settles into the body and stays. Pacino's grief was not about loneliness alone. It was about finality, about knowing that the one person who truly understood the man behind the myth was gone, taking that understanding with her. Fame could not witness his private self. Awards could not validate his emotional life. Only Diane had seen him clearly, without reverence or illusion. As he looked back, Pacino understood that time does not punish. It reveals. It shows which choices mattered and which distractions merely delayed consequence. He had not failed professionally. He had not wasted his talent. But he had underestimated the fragility of love. He had assumed it would wait, that it would remain available until he felt ready. Time proved otherwise. In the twilight of life, Pacino faced a truth as stark as any script. Love does not require perfection. It requires presence. And presence, once withheld too long, cannot be reclaimed. Diane had not asked him to become someone else. She had asked him to stay as himself, fully and without escape. That request, simple and terrifying, was the one he never answered. Now, with the noise of the world quieter, Pacino sits with the consequence of that silence. He continues to work. He continues to create. But beneath every role lies the same unspoken knowledge. The greatest performance of his life was never on screen. It was the one he avoided. Choosing love when it asked for permanence. Age has given him honesty, if not relief. He no longer romanticizes hesitation. He names it. He sees it for what it was. And in that clarity lies both sorrow and a strange dignity. Because recognition, even late, is a form of truth. And truth, once accepted, is the final role no actor can refuse. In the later years of Al Pacino's life, something subtle but unmistakable began to change. The hunger that once drove him toward relentless work softened into something more reflective. Roles still mattered, but they no longer defined him completely. What began to surface instead was a quieter pursuit, an attempt to repair what could still be touched, even if the past itself remained unreachable. Fatherhood became the most visible expression of that shift. Pacino had children at stages of life when many men were already withdrawing from responsibility. Unlike earlier decades, he did not treat this role as an afterthought. He showed up. He adjusted his schedule. He learned patience in ways that surprised those who had known him as volatile and obsessive. Friends remarked that he seemed calmer around his children, less guarded, more willing to listen than to dominate a room. Yet even this transformation carried a shadow. Being a present father forced Pacino to confront the contrast between what he was learning to do now and what he had been unable to do then. Love, once again, demanded presence rather than performance. And while he could not rewrite his past with Diane Keaton, he could at least refuse to repeat the same pattern entirely. There was also a shift in how Pacino approached his craft. His performances grew quieter, more inward. He gravitated toward characters wrestling with regret, memory, and moral exhaustion. Men looking back more than forward. Men aware that time had shaped them in ways no triumph could erase. Audiences sensed the authenticity. These were not roles inhabited for acclaim, but for recognition. He was no longer trying to conquer a character. He was trying to understand one. Behind the scenes, Pacino spoke more openly about vulnerability. He acknowledged fear. He admitted mistakes, not in confessional bursts, but in thoughtful, measured reflections. He spoke of love as something fragile, easily misunderstood, and dangerously postponed. There was no attempt to justify his choices anymore. Only an acceptance that avoidance carries a cost, and that cost compounds over time. Diane Keaton's absence remained a quiet constant. Pacino did not invoke her name frequently, but when he did, the tone was unmistakable. Respect, gratitude, loss. He never framed her as a missed opportunity in a transactional sense, but as a presence that had once offered balance. Someone who had seen him without myth or projection. Someone who had asked him to stay when staying felt like surrender. That memory lingered, not as punishment, but as instruction. In many ways, Pacino's later life became an exercise in redemption without erasure. He could not undo what had happened. He could not return to the moment when choice would have altered everything. But he could choose differently now. He could listen more. He could remain present when discomfort arose. He could accept love without fleeing from its weight. These were small acts, invisible to the public, but meaningful in their accumulation. Legacy, too, began to take on a different meaning. For decades, Pacino's legacy was measured in performances, awards, and cultural impact. But as time narrowed, he seemed more concerned with the personal residue he would leave behind. Not how he would be remembered as an actor, but how he had been experienced as a man. That question does not yield to applause. It answers only to those who shared the room. There is no grand redemption arc in Pacino's story. No final gesture that resolves everything neatly. What exists instead is a quiet adjustment, a recognition that life does not offer clean conclusions. Growth does not arrive as triumph. It arrives as humility, as an understanding that some lessons are learned too late to change the past, but just in time to shape what remains. Pacino continues to work, continues to appear, continues to create. But beneath every public moment lies a private reckoning that never fully recedes. Diane Keaton's absence is not a wound that heals. It is a reference point, a reminder of what love asked for and what fear withheld. Yet even that reminder carries a strange gift. It has taught him to value presence over protection, honesty over distance. In the end, Pacino's search for redemption is not about forgiveness from others. It is about learning to live without running from connection, to sit with memory without rewriting it, to love where love is still possible without postponement. And while that does not erase regret, it transforms it into something quieter, more bearable, a guide rather than a sentence. For a man who once believed that freedom meant never being tied down, age has delivered a gentler, harder truth. Freedom is not the absence of commitment. It is the courage to remain when commitment asks you to stay. When the story of Al Pacino is finally told in full, it will not end with awards, standing ovations, or iconic lines echoed across generations. It will end quietly where all honest lives end, in the space between what was achieved and what was never chosen. Because for all the brilliance of his career, the most revealing truth about Pacino's life was never performed on screen. It lived in the silences he carried. Pacino conquered cinema by leaning into darkness. He gave the world characters shaped by power, isolation, obsession, and moral fracture. He made audiences believe that intensity itself was a form of truth. But off camera, that same intensity often kept him at a distance from the one thing that demanded no performance: love. With Diane Keaton, he encountered something rare, a relationship that did not ask him to be larger than life, only fully present. And presence, for a man trained to disappear into roles, proved more frightening than any fictional abyss. Diane's death did not create Pacino's regret. It revealed it. It stripped away the possibility of reinterpretation, of someday explanations, of future understanding. What remained was the truth, unadorned. That love, once deferred too often, does not wait. It leaves quietly, taking with it the version of ourselves we never finished becoming. In his final years, Pacino is no longer running. He has learned to sit with memory without trying to reshape it. He understands now that hesitation can be as decisive as action, and sometimes far more damaging. The silence he once used as protection has become his teacher. It reminds him that courage is not found in intensity or control, but in the willingness to stay when staying feels dangerous. The tragedy of Al Pacino is not that he failed to love. It is that he loved deeply, yet trusted fear more than connection. Diane Keaton offered him a shared life. He offered her admiration, devotion, and delay. That imbalance did not explode into scandal. It simply endured until time closed the account without appeal. And yet, there is something quietly human in this ending. Pacino's story mirrors the fear many people carry, the belief that there will always be more time, more chances, more courage later. His life stands as a reminder that brilliance does not protect us from regret, and success does not substitute for presence. When the applause fades, what remains is not legacy, but memory. The people who knew us when we were unguarded. The moments when love asked for permanence. In that silence, Pacino finally understands the role he avoided. Not the legend, not the actor, but the man who might have stayed. And in understanding it at last, even without resolution, he leaves behind something more valuable than perfection. A truth worth remembering.